Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Trina and I'm Director of Building Better. I want to welcome you all to this session on practical updates for housing associations delivering MMC now. Thank you all for joining us. It's the post-lunch slot. So to help with that, we've got three excellent speakers. I'm going to do a really quick introduction and let me tell you a little bit about the format as well. So we've got half an hour for a more traditional Q&A. I'm going to throw some stats towards the speakers, get their take on those stats. I'll tell you a little bit more about what those stats are as well. And then we'll have a few sort of pointed questions. And then the remainder of the time, we've got 10 more minutes, is for Q&A. So please do put up your hand and put your questions to the panelists as well. I'm sure they'll be very happy to answer whatever anyone's got to ask. So first of all, let me do some introductions. We've got Tony Woods at the end, who's Technical Manager for Procurement for Housing. Procurement for Housing works with Building Better super closely and of course is sponsoring and exhibiting this whole area. We've got Paul Mullin from Halton Housing, Director of Development and Sales, and also a Building Better board member. And we've got Katie Gill-Martin, who's already done two speaking sessions today, one very high demand. Katie is Head of Business Development and Innovation at Platform Housing Group. And Platform are doing some really interesting land-led delivery using MMC or modern method construction or off-site construction. And I should say as well, as a quick note, that when we're talking about MMC, I'm primarily talking about category 1 or modular or volumetric, so that's where you have the whole kind of box coming together, and also category 2, so where you have like a panelized system that comes together, usually on site. Okay, so what I wanted to first share with the panel is some statistics from a National Housing Federation survey that looked at modern method construction delivery by housing associations, or MMC delivery by housing associations, in 2022-2023, and I want to get their take on what those findings might be telling us. So the survey found that in 2022-2023, housing associations delivered homes. 25% of the homes they delivered were using either category 1 or category 2, so some form of volumetric or panelized housing. So that's a quarter of all delivery across the board. But when you focus on those housing associations that did even a little bit of MMC, that number goes up to a third. So if you exclude the housing associations that didn't do any modern method construction, then a third of completed homes was using category 1 and category 2, as well as starts on site. 93% of completions was using category 2 or category 2 and 5. So again, that's panelized or panelized and sub-assembly systems. So although 7% of delivery was by modular, and that is broadly where the press scrutiny and the kind of all the attention goes, actually the vast majority of MMC delivery is panelized systems. 2/3 of delivery of that entire MMC delivery by housing associations was those that got grant from the Affordable Homes Programme. So over 60% of those MMC homes were delivered using government grant in the form of Affordable Homes Programme grant. And then maybe a couple more stats to chuck at you. In terms of future delivery, the housing association surveyed said that within 5 years, between 2023 to 2028, they plan to build 30,591 homes, so let's say roughly 30,000 homes. But if you take that and you broaden it out and use the kind of social housing regulators forecast and the proportion they're actually building compared to what they say they are, that number's closer to 107,000. So we think between 2023 to 2028, housing associations are going to deliver somewhere between 30,000 and 107,000 MMC homes. And finally, two more things. 2/3 of respondents said that the biggest benefit for MMC was that it was more environmentally sustainable or it was easier to achieve future home standard. Program certainty and diversification pipeline was not seen as a useful benefit of MMC. And in terms of barriers, unsurprisingly, 73% of respondents said supply vulnerability was the biggest barrier, and the second one was cost. What was interesting, again, was that loan securitization and procurement were not seen as a barrier to delivering MMC. So that's all the stats I'm going to chuck at you. I'm going to do a really quick summary. So those housing associations that use MMC, about a third of starts and finishes. Over 9 out of 10 MMC homes tend to be Cat 2 or Cat 2 and 5. Affordable Homes Programme partners are driving much of that delivery. The numbers could be between 30,500 to 107,000 over the next 4 years. And the biggest drivers are sort of environmental, quality, future home standard related things, and the biggest barriers are supplier vulnerability. So I think I'll come to Katie first, because you've got the mic. Katie, let us know, what are your sort of high level thoughts on what you're hearing in those stats?
I forgot the first stat already. There was a lot in there. So I could probably say something today that I wouldn't have ordinarily said because Homes England aren't here. So my initial thoughts are like little surprise, and particularly the point around the Affordable Homes Programme delivery. So. And the Category 2 point. And I think what we're seeing in the market is a growing or a shifting of those PLC volume house builders towards the what we might call MMC space, but I think that's probably very, very loosely attributing that term to what we're seeing as a really huge growth of timber frame manufacture and delivery among the PLCs and the big house builders. So they saw the writing on the wall in terms of that kind of market indicator that Homes England offered with the target setting, particularly for categories 1 and 2 via the Affordable Homes Programme. And so what we're largely seeing in my experience, particularly at Platform, is that our initial quite lofty, quite stretching MMC ambitions have kind of faded and blended into the traditional partnership model delivery approach, and instead the innovation, if you will, has been left with those volume house builders who have probably done about as much as been required from them to meet that Category 2 definition set out within the Homes England and Cars Consultancy definitions. And so it leaves us with a little bit of a gap to fill. But I would just add a couple more stats on top of Trina's, which I've just fact-checked with Rowan, so thanks Rowan, and written them on my hand. So before they fade, I will just add a couple more into the mix, which is if you have seen the biggest builder numbers in Inside Housing, you'll see two things that I pulled out very quickly, which is that we had 42,000 completions this year, but we're looking at a drop down to only about 33,000 starts. And the other thing is that the G15 are forecasting a 76% reduction in delivery. So we know that there is huge pressures on house building across the board, which is putting a real downward pressure on numbers everywhere. And I think all of those challenges are just compounded in the kind of what you might call more innovative or the higher Category 2s in the Category 1 space. So I think what most people are doing from my perspective, and is probably echoed in those numbers you've shared, is they are continuing to play in what feels like a fairly safe environment in those Category 2s with the delivery mechanisms, with the big builders that they feel most comfortable with. And it's a shame, and I'm not advocating for that, but I think that's probably the story that's underlining a lot of the stats that you've shared.
Thank you, Katie. Shall I pass on to Paul and then Tony?
Thank you. I've got nothing written on my hand, by the way. I think some of the stats I kind of find quite interesting. It just feels like we as a sector have moved quite a long way along the way. If you talked about MMC not that long ago, it was like being take a breath, and would we really be bothered with that kind of thing, and didn't really understand it. So I think if you look at the survey, it's really good. I think there was one stat was only 4% of people, organisations were saying they wouldn't do it flatly. I think that would have been quite a higher percentage maybe 5 years ago on that one. So I think I thought that was really telling. Another one in there though, there's a big jump, I guess, from saying I definitely not doing it to actually I'm going to do it. And I guess what backs that up, within there was a stat saying about 35% of people saying they wouldn't be able to say whether they would or wouldn't do it in the future. So I think from that point of view, we've moved, but I still think we need to move further and get people really, really involved in it. I get what you're talking about with the kind of current program. It is slowing things down on that kind of basis. It isn't helping being able to do that. But it's the same gripe we always go on about. We love the sector moaning about the housing programme and whenever it slows the market down and whatever. I guess probably the other thing I found from the survey was that real shift from Cat 1 to Cat 2. Really stark shift from Cat 1 to Cat 2. I think when we all started in this journey, Cat 1 was the holy grail that we went to. It was going to solve all our problems. It was the thing that you get and you drop it on your site, you walk away, everybody thinks you're brilliant. And actually, in reality, it's a lot harder than that. You know, I think for the businesses involved, it meant a huge amount of capital to actually get to the point of getting a unit into the ground. And I mean a unit as in part of the units of the things they built. And we just weren't set up for the pipeline kind of thing. I think what's really come out, there was a real disconnect between the pipeline that genuinely we could deliver as a sector, not the pipeline we wanted to deliver. That was different. There was a real ambition to drive more of a higher pipeline. But actually I think the reality of how Building Better came together, trying to pull that pipeline together. And we've struggled with it. We've struggled being able to get a pipeline that gave the Cat 1s the real confidence to be able to continue to do it on that kind of basis. So I do see Cat 2 has come along. I think it's matured, I guess, a bit as well, kind of the Cat 2, the offer that's out there as well now. And I do think for us now, I see the Cat 2 is really opening up and giving a lot more flexibility kind of thing in the approach. A lot of the negativity around, and I'm not saying I agree with it, with around Cat 1 was there was not as much. You were buying their product. If you liked their block, that was it. If you didn't, tough, you couldn't have anything else. But I think the Cat 2 gives a bit more flexibility. There's more risks around it as well. I guess it's a little bit more like what we're used to. I think people thought Cat 1 was what we did. We entered a contract with somebody and they gave me a number of homes at the end of it kind of thing. And I think people thought Cat 1 was that, and it's not. It's a manufacturing deal, which is quite different. And I guess now Category 2 is probably getting us a bit closer to how we used to do things, and I think that's starting to, I think that's why we're seeing the trend, people saying, actually, it's not as scary as I think now, because it's not something that turns up in the back of lorry old and your curtains waving in the windows at you or whatever. It is something that feels a bit more construction, a bit more I can understand, and as a business, I can get my business to understand it as well. So that's kind of what I thought the kind of data was kind of throwing out.
Thank you, Paul. And I'll hand over to Tony. Tony, maybe you hadn't planned to. It'd be good to cover the drivers and the barriers, because I reckon day in, day out, you're sort of hearing some of that from the housing associations, local authorities approaching you.
Well, I think, as we've touched on, you know, some of the questions about viability of off-site manufacturers. So we've seen the failure of quite a few over the recent years, which has then coloured people's approach to off-site manufacturing. And I think, as the other speakers have touched on, it's that thing that I think Cat 1 was sold as the solution, and we were trying to run before we could walk. And unlike other areas where, you know, Ministry of Justice or schools or healthcare, where they've got a clear programme of work, it's far more fragmented. You know, the affordable housing programme is split up over 100 organisations who've then got to find land, and they're all found on an individual basis. Some of that may already have planning in place, and as I know most of you here, the last thing you want to hear from a manufacturer is, if you spent 2 years trying to get planning, is the first thing we want to do is we need to redesign it, and can we go back into planning? So that's not what you want to hear. So we've seen that change, and I think there was a lot of investment up front by people who perhaps didn't understand the nuances of where we're going compared to other industries. And I think the off-site manufacturers, Cat 1s now, there's still some good ones out there, but they're looking at more niche parts of the market where it really works for them. And I think, you know, some of the feedback for people is looking at doing your due diligence with those organisations, you know, see what their cash flow is, and perhaps not overextending those organisations, which I think is what happened in the past. They had large amounts of investment, you know, large factories potentially delivering thousands of units, we've got massive overheads, and how, you know, feeding the beast. Once you've got a factory in place, those costs are just running on and on all the time. So it's looking at those organisations, and there still are some about, how you'd work with those to deliver that. And just touching on, we said about the private house builders, you know, if you look back at Barratt's, I think they were changing from the point of view of the issue with resources and people to actually deliver their properties. So probably about 4 or 5 years ago, they actually took their entire house pattern book and changed it so they can deliver with MMC. They now own Oregon Timber, their own timber frame manufacturer. So a lot of the big house builders have their own supply chain in place. I think Katie touched on this. Over the years when I've been doing presentations, part of the reason why they're changing is because they've got to change. They've got to do something different, and the skill shortage has been the tsunami that's been coming for a very long time. And I think if you take the analogy, as social housing providers, we've been the people sitting on the beach looking at the fish flapping in the sand, and the private house builders have been the ones that have been moving to the hills and protecting their supply chain. And now we're in that position, we've got to pick up on that side as well. And just finally, if you're talking about the numbers there, there's still a bit of a perception with off-site manufacturing, like how long is it going to last and is it going to be durable and things like that. Well, if you consider north of the border, up in Scotland, 85% of all the houses that are built from timber frame, and it's wetter and windier up in Scotland. So I think we're on a par with about that 85% equates to about the similar amount of houses we're building in England at the moment with timber frame. So there is a way to do that. I think up in Scotland they've probably only got about 2 modular manufacturers up there, because predominantly it's panelised systems. And again, you think about the problems you have of planning and those issues, the panelised systems give you more flexibility. And it's that holy grail of Cat 1 is, have we got a brownfield site, or can we enter into an early agreement with the off-site manufacturer? We always remember design for manufacture. Those of us older in the room can probably remember that. I think it's 1996. We still haven't quite nailed that all these years later. So perhaps for the younger generation, you can pick up on that, and it's that early engagement. And I think just finally, with the overheating of the market and lack of resources, when people are looking at their construction program, we've spoken about a long time aggregation of demand from the point of view of MMC, but it's what organisations should be thinking about now, for even if they're building traditionally, because those suppliers are going to be busy with less resources, and it's actually about putting a program of work together and working with those organisations over a period of time on a number of sites. Because the other thing we all talk about is social value as well. So if you've got a program of work with your local construction company, they can start to invest in apprentices, additional staff, which brings resources into the market. So I think I've probably said enough at that point.
Thank you, Tony. All really good points. I'm going to come back to Katie to say, to ask really what you can share about the mood in platform. I think maybe 2 things here to reflect on. What is the mood in the leadership team, in the exec team, maybe the finance team making the decision, and what is the mood within the development team or the team that's kind of doing the land-led delivery or otherwise? And I have a second part to the question, but maybe I'll ask you this bit first.
The mood. I always start these things, I look around, I'm like, who's here before? And my comms guy is here, so as long as we're not live. So I think this time last year, I spoke with you, and we were talking about a deal that we were about 24 hours away from with Ilka. And I think it was when we were here last year that we got the texts on the Tuesday night going, it's over, it's done, like, that's it. And it was, a relief because the murmurs had been happening for long enough that we were dragging our heels on bringing the deal across the line. But, that leaves a kind of lingering memory in terms of we were really close to that being a really naff situation. And so we've watched, as I'm sure all of you have, over the last 12 months, that was probably the second in then a number of dominoes falling. And we can have a conversation. I would imagine most people in the panel, most people in the audience, I'm looking at a lot of you I recognise, we run the risk of being a little bit of an echo chamber, and we all know the reality of that Cat 1, Cat 2 makeup in the market. I think actually the reality is our boards probably don't, and I think our boards will hear MMC and they're sort of like their ears stick up, and that nervousness creeps in around what about Ilka and what about Lighthouse and what a Top Hat up to, and it's really unfortunate because that stuff sticks. particularly with boards who are operating in an environment, as I said before, which is increasingly difficult to deliver in. And when we're looking at delivery, they want risks locked down, and they want that financial due diligence to be wrapped up with a bow on it and be absolutely watertight. And what I would say is that in terms of I would probably say actually for both those groups that you talked about, because if we're talking about our finance teams and our boards who are approving this stuff, but actually our in-house teams who have then got to oversee delivery, it is a headache if you have a company go bust when you're on site. That is a complete pain. So they are equally as interested and have a vested interest in us making sure that we're going into contract with organisations that are a going concern, and making sure that we've got those contracts absolutely locked in and we've got a plan B. So what I would say in terms of the mood is that we are a strategic partner, so we've got funding coming in via the Affordable Homes Programme, and we are one of those organisations that is pretty much all of our delivery is category 2, and that's for exactly the reasons that you've said, which is you can typically use the same contracts, you don't really have to change much about the way that you manage that project, and from a due diligence and risk management perspective, it feels much more comfortable for all of the existing structures within an organisation, from approval all the way through to delivery. So I've been saying this since as long as you and I have been talking about MMC, which is quite some time, Trina. But the methods of construction have been modernised. That happened. We then had a piece of work that really needed to happen, which was then modernising everything else that happened in between the homes being manufactured and actually getting them onto a site. And that's contracts, that's procurement routes, that's everything else. The challenge is we're now in a really difficult spot in terms of social housing delivery, and what everyone is looking for is certainty and affordability. And we were, and I'm sure many of you were, looking at Future Home Standard. It's a bit of a green light for a lot of the MMC products available, and that was going to be the sort of justification and open the gate for delivery of a lot of the really good quality product. And I can see quite a few manufacturers here, but your really good quality product that had those fabric efficiencies that we were hoping were going to be reflected in that change in building regs. And so the final thing I would just say in terms of mood is like slight deflation, because what we now know is that sort of ability to say, you know, these guys can get to a fabric performance that we just can't achieve anywhere else or via any other method of construction isn't really likely to be coming through in the next 12 months. So I think we are just head down, keep delivering, because we've got a housing crisis in addition to a quality crisis and a climate crisis. We've got a housing crisis on our hands, and our priority is to continue delivering. And I'd say that's probably reflected elsewhere in the sector as well.
Thank you, Katie. I think one of the things you've really beautifully articulated for me anyway is in which ways the sector is maturing. I think you set out really neatly how the forms of construction need to get modernised, and that happened, and then everything around it needed to get, and it feels like now we're in this sort of very head down delivery mode. And to that point, Paul, if I could come to you with your Building Better board hat on, sorry, I don't know if I'm like not sort of talking to the mic, is what are you hearing about the ways in which some of our members are trying to mitigate for that risk in this kind of head down delivery phase? And while you're thinking on that question, something else that's kind of niggling at me at the back of my mind, it's not a fully formed question for all of you really, is I worry that a lot of the real innovation in the market happened at a side of the market where we've seen a lot of the insolvencies, and so I feel like there's something there around innovation and what that means for the sector and what the appetite for that innovation is, and will that appetite come back and when will it come back? So maybe I can come back to that theme later, but first, if I can ask you, Paul, what are the sort of strategies for reducing risk that you're hearing on the board?
Yeah, I suppose for years we've been complaining that MMC and traditional are seen as two separate things. I suppose the good news is, from board's perspective, I think they're just talking about the same thing, which is risk mitigation.
Yeah.
So it's not actually the debate about is it MMC isn't actually in there anymore. On that one, it's more we've had some MMC steel frames done, never even blipped with radar on the radar with board. It was, well, that contractor we've not worked with before, how do we know they're not going to go bust? kind of thing, and you kind of go, well, how do you know the contractor you do know isn't going to go bust? So actually they've come together. So a lot of the debate now is just around mitigation and how do you protect the cash that you release from your business into another business. How do you protect that? So I think a lot of the debates that we're going to, because even Section 106 and whatever is changes, the way the payment profiles are going on those are increasing risk. So as a business, there's just more risk around delivering homes, I think, on that basis. It does mean MMC isn't sitting out as an outliner now. And I guess that does help from the point of view that you then are getting into a similar discussion with whatever way you're looking to deliver your homes. And it's about then being able to demonstrate to your finance colleagues and to boards about how you can mitigate the risk. And I think the Cat 1 there was more chunky payments going out than maybe there would have been with Cat 2, and you can break that down into more manageable chunks. I think there's also the bit about if a Cat 1 manufacturer goes, you're very much stuck with their product and their unit type that was coming down the road and on the back of a trailer. With Cat 2, you got more potential that somebody else could step in and take on that design or design something very similar and do it, or pick up the product and build it for you. So again, there's a number of different ways that looking at the Cat 2 could mitigate it. So the type of category you go down on it. I think that's just the way you've got to do it. I think the way that we as a sector have been real lazy buggers for years, and we've tried to dump all the risk on that side and say, it doesn't, I'm going to pay a bit more money for it, but it all sits there. And it was a fantasy, because as soon as that contract goes bust, it all comes flying back in your direction, and it's a nightmare to sort. So I think as clients, we need to get better understanding, well, what is the risk kind of thing, and not pretend something's never going to happen. Plan for when it does happen, hopefully it never does. And I think that's what boards are expecting now, saying, yes, it looks lovely, but what happens if this contractor or this manufacturer, whatever goes, and we have to be able to answer that question and say, this is how I've mitigated it. But MMC is no different to any other contract. You can only mitigate the risk. You can't remove it. The only way you can remove it is don't build, don't buy a manufactured product. Kind of, that's the only way you'll ever mitigate the risk completely. Kind of thing. And I think it's just that education with boards and breaking it down with teams and actually just going one bit at a time and understanding what the risk is to the business. And at some point, the business has to take a decision on, I'm comfortable with that level of risk, kind of thing. And I think that's the important bit is, I think with MMC before, boards and businesses didn't understand what they were getting into. All hell broke loose and everybody was going, my God, I didn't realize it was going to cost me this. So I think as long as you go in and you're clear about what you believe those risks are and you've reported that properly, then you're mitigating that risk, I think, from that point of view.
Thank you, Paul. I'm going to come to one more question to Tony, and then I'm going to come to the audience for any questions that you might have. Tony, I wanted to ask, what are the trends we're seeing in the supply side? So we've obviously lost some manufacturers, which is incredibly sad, but we are also seeing some innovations as well, and I wondered if you could talk maybe about some of the trends we're seeing, both in terms of manufacturers, but maybe some of the innovation trends as well.
Yeah, as we say, I mean, the main trend is there's fewer Cat 1 suppliers there, but they're becoming more specialised, and they're finding their niche in the market. And I think it was interesting for me because we, unfortunately, on the PFH framework, we lost 2 of our Cat 1 manufacturers. So we lost Ilke and Impact Modular. So we went out and re-procured. And it was interesting because we had 8 companies who actually bid to be on that framework. However, 2 of those that put in a tender submission were gone before we completed the evaluation due to financials. On the other side, again, looking at due diligence and coming back to the point Paul made about contractors and things, funny enough, those that have been in the market longer tended to have pricing that was higher but probably sustainable. You know, you find new entries in the market tend to put in very low prices, but is that actually sustainable to use? So that's one of the key things, is that they're now looking at where does Cat 1 systems work, what type of projects, And there are some good companies out there that are doing that. People like ZPods who are concentrating on brownfield sites where they can work with the client, they can work at those early stages, do feasibility and things to actually deliver that value back to the members for the project. And I think regarding innovation, again, touching on Katie's point, Future Home Standard, I guess we were here in 2015 with the Code for Sustainable Homes. We should have been at net zero carbon by 2016, but we cut red tape and we stopped it. And I think we've done exactly the same thing again this time. So for those who aren't aware, Future Home Standard is the current building regulations, but you put a heat pump in. And the two options, one of the options is actually take the 40% of PVs out of the equation and get rid of them as well. So it could actually be a step backwards from that point of view. So again, you know, we've had a couple of full storms where with higher performance, better insulation should be driving us in that direction. But I think the other thing is as well, looking at the innovation side, it's from the point of view of members looking at their build costs, but also their long-term whole life costs for the buildings. And if you're going to be caught out again in a few years' time, if government turns around and says all rented properties have got to be EPC B or A rated, and how much cost is that going to add on for retrofitting? Because we all know the problems we've had when we've had to get properties to EPC. So is it worth trying to take those properties as far as you can, sort of fabric wise, because it's cheaper to do it at construction phase rather than it is retrofitting, you know? And I think it has unfairly stifled innovation to a certain extent. You know, it's stopping. There is some good innovation out there, but have we got the demand for it? Probably not, because it's still the status quo. We can carry on building the way we have been, and we don't need to do that. So there's going to be a lot of manufacturers which are caught out from that side of things. And just touching on, we've got an event coming up, as you know, on the 4th of July. All the parties have talked about 300,000 houses. You know, they're going to build 300,000 houses. I always thought perhaps, you know, private house builders actually build about 180,000 and social housing providers build another 40 or 50,000. So if the government's going to build 300,000 houses on top of that, we should be in quite a good state, shouldn't we? But joking aside from that, if you look at the issue, I think last year we built 240,000 houses, round about there. So for us to achieve 300,000 houses, that's the equivalent of 4 Barratts coming into the housing market and delivering the equivalent of Barratts. So my question would be, where are 4 Barratts going to come from in the housing market? Because we're hearing it's a Dutch auction at the moment, everybody's claiming they're going to build more houses. So we're seeing the private house builders at the moment using MMC to deliver what they can, but you're talking about then double them. And from Barratt's point of view, that would mean them near enough building their entire land bank in 1 year, which is great, but what are they going to do the following year?
Okay, I think that kind of draws us to the end of this sort of initial panel bit, and I'm going to open up to questions. But if I just quickly summarize some of the kind of key themes I've heard, the mood feels a bit low, and I think that is symptomatic of where the whole sector is and how many strains and pressures there are. However, there is a lot to take light from the fact that actually much of the Cat 2 systems that a few years ago we didn't even know the difference between modular Cat 1, Cat 2. You're talking about differences in definitions, Paul. Katie, you referenced the lack of, there's maybe not that clarity. There is greater understanding and there is a greater use of MMC through volume house builders. Again, the tricky bit then is that they're not necessarily incentivized to go down loads of innovation and doing loads of R&D, and that is something that traditionally maybe we want housing associations to do, but unless we have government support and maybe a change and a more ambitious sort of energy requirement or performance specification, that's where that drive is going to come from. So yeah, I think it's tricky, but maybe something to take kind of positive light from, particularly when thinking about the future. So I'm going to come to the audience now to ask if anyone's got any questions. We have got one. Excellent. If you could say who you are and which organisation you're from as well, please.
Hi, I'm Marit Heinonen-Smith. I'm an architect working for Arcadis, Building Safety Act. Any comments on that one? Any thoughts? Because every building is affected, regardless whether they're high risk or not. So we have some love using MMC, some concerns about panelized options and especially the insulation used in them. Any thoughts? Have you been affected by this?
Do you have something to say, Katie? No. Yeah.
Well, there's two sides to that. Working with some of the manufacturers, with the level of detail you're required to provide. Manufacturers have got good control over the materials they're using, the people they're using as well. So I think a lot of the time people they introduce extra things that off-site manufacturers have to do, but they work in a factory. They've got the same people there every week. They can give you a list of all the materials they use. They can tell you who the people were on site or in the factory who are fitting the plasterboard. They can tell you what fixings they've used, and they can probably document it. If you went to a construction site, can you guarantee that same level of reassurance? And I think a number of the manufacturers now, particularly the modular ones, are documenting that. Some of them are running into trouble because the building safety wants to geolocate where you've taken the picture. And they say, well, we built one module here and then we move it down the production line next week. So they're working with them to do that. But the amount of information they provide should, in theory, make your life a lot easier from that point of view. Regarding combustible materials, there's this thing, 11 metres, you can't have combustible materials in the external walls of buildings. So a lot of them are taking that on board and not including combustible materials. But I think the other thing to raise is, what is a combustible material? Because people turn around and say, well, timber, that's combustible. But the other question is, what are the best performing fire doors you can put in a building? They're 44mm thick, solid timber fire doors. But the argument is it's timber, so it's combustible. So again, engineering judgment, but I think the off-site manufacturers are in a good position to provide you with the level of information and the detail you need, and also the confidence. Again, coming to that point, you know who's in that factory and who's actually carrying out those activities.
Perfect. We have got one more question. I just want to check to see we're okay for a couple more minutes. Are we okay for one more question, Lucinda, or should we wrap it up? One more quick question. One more quick question. If you take it from, or Elodie.
Hi, Elle George from Elevate. Tony, I really love your fish on the beach thing, because everyone's just looking at that and not looking at what's happening in the ocean. Now, I have a question. As if it's not hard enough, what about embodied carbon? Are you going to start asking questions within the procurement frameworks to make sure that that's being considered, or are you going to wait until it becomes legislation, which will happen?
I will pass it on to the Housing Association representatives on the panel.
From us, sadly no. And I'd probably go back to my previous point, which is we're in delivery mode. So we've had a focus on operational carbon first and foremost. So we've rewritten our specification to be gas-free, PV, and kind of future home standard-esque already. We're going to have to do quite a bit of work with our partners to get comfortable with that and measuring that. And I think for us, one of the big barriers to measurement of embodied carbon across our program is our partners' ability to do it in a consistent and meaningful way. That's not to say it's not something that's on the horizon, hopefully fairly soon. But as I've kind of referenced, I think in everything I've said today, we are looking at so many challenges just with maintaining delivery. So a lot of RPs are winding up delivery almost entirely. I think that we've just got to be, and not to continue with a fairly low mood, but pragmatic. And I think operational carbon feels like, given the direction travel with policy and regulation and what we've got to be doing anyway, like a slightly easier thing to do before we start thinking about embodied carbon, which I know, Elle, because I know you, is not the answer you wanted to hear, so I do apologise.
Okay.
Is your answer any different?
No, I basically agree with that. And I think it's just also, I think at this time, if we went out to try to get the expertise to do it, I don't think it's out there yet. Everybody wants to do it, but nobody quite knows how to do it. So I think it might take that regulation to come in and kick us to actually force us to do it.
Just quickly, from my point of view, under the procurement regulations now, anybody who's procuring something over the O2 threshold as it used to be, they have to have a carbon reduction plan in place. That's a requirement by government for them to do that. But again, coming back to the question about combustible materials and things like that, you've got the anomaly where, you know, people are saying, well, timber's not good from the point of view of combustibility, but it's great from the point of view of carbon reduction in construction. So will things flick around again and change? I don't know, but there's a sort of two things are opposed at the moment.
Okay, I think I should definitely wrap it up now, draw it to close. So thank you to all of you for being here, paying attention, asking questions, and thank you to the excellent speakers as well.